Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Jamie Meyer. I'm the Executive Director of Piedmont Environmental Alliance, and I'm so glad that you could make it on this dreary quarantine day of Earth Week. Piedmont Environmental Alliance, of course, we are the homegrown, the local environmental nonprofit here in Winston-Salem, and we are the host of the Piedmont Earth Day Fair. Of course, this year we've gone virtual. We've had tons of programs, panels and webinars and virtual field trips and how-to programs available online, blogs, all sorts of activities. And we're so thrilled tonight to welcome some really special participants for our Interfaith panel on climate and the environment. So I just want to welcome, we've got Reverend Craig Schaub from Parkway United Church of Christ, Rabbi Mark Cohn, and I'm so sorry if you can hear the noise in the background. It's dinner time at our house. We've got Reverend Craig Schaub of Parkway United Church of Christ. We've got Rabbi Mark Cohn from Temple Emanuel, and Reverend Kelly Carpenter from Green Street United Methodist Church. And unfortunately, Imam of the Community Mosque of Winston-Salem is not feeling well and won't be able to make it today. But I look forward to when we can all be together and well in person soon. So we've got some questions that we're going to get started tonight and ask our panelists to just start to have a discussion about some faith traditions and the environment, what particular communities are doing around sustainability and climate justice here in Winston-Salem, and some just really great questions that the panel came up with. And then we'll open it up to participants. Feel free to ask a question in the Q&A box, or if you have that raise your hand icon when we get to Q&A, there'll be time for questions. All right, so we'll kick it off with our first question, which we'll just kind of go around and talk about how your faith tradition informs decisions that you make that impact the environment. And how does that tradition impact the way that you understand our climate crisis and what we're facing around environmental issues? So Reverend Craig, you're at the top of my pictures right now, so I'll have you start us off.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for inviting us to this conversation. Good to be with all of you. Just briefly get started, maybe a couple of things that come to the top of my head. Obviously, the sacred texts, and I would say what sticks out in the front of my mind from the Christian tradition would be from the letters of Paul in Romans. It talks about creation waiting for the revealing of the children of God. And in some ways, I really feel like that's true, that creation is waiting for us to actually grow up enough, to be aware enough of our interdependence and our place in all of this. And so that would be one thing. I would say the Psalms is profoundly important. I think the Psalms express such a range of emotion and perspective. And I think for us in faith traditions, what's really important right now is to make room for all of the things that we're feeling, the grief, to be able to really lament, and as well as to fall in love with sacred presence and the creation, as well as this sense of interdependent community with creation and other human beings. And then lastly, I would say the mystic tradition. You know, I was reading yesterday morning again, Julian of Norwich, looking at this little ball, like a hazelnut, and hearing a voice that says, in this, all of creation. And I would say not just the Christian mystic tradition, but across the spiritual traditions really is helpful in learning our place, our humble place. You know, creation probably could do quite well without us, and yet we are invited to have a role as we grow into awareness.
Fantastic. Rabbi Mark, can you say a little bit about what your faith tradition is and how that informs decisions that you make about the environment and your understanding of where we are today?
Sure. And like I'm sure Reverend Kelly and Pastor Craig, we are very grateful to be here and for the work that Piedmont Environmental Association does for our larger community, to help us remember that no matter what our faith tradition is, whatever our background is, or lack of faith tradition and affiliation, we are all creatures of God, and we are all part of this larger creation. And so I'm really glad to be here. Certainly in Jewish life, we talk about 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So I don't know that I speak for anyone beyond me, but I think if we look into, let's just go straight into the creation story in Genesis 1. And I think it's very significant that the Torah starts, the 5 books of Moses starts with 11 chapters of kind of global life. And then it's going to zoom in chapter 12 into Abraham. And we talk about Abraham as the kind of the first Jew, so to speak. He makes the covenant with God that ultimately will create the Jewish people. But if we look in the Genesis 1 story and the creation that happens there of the 7 days, the rabbis look into that and say every day had a partner except for Shabbat, the Sabbath, the 7th day. That 6 days we work, and then the 7th we are to rest. The 7th day is holy, which you could spell either way. It is holy unto itself. What do I mean the days are paired? Well, if you ever thought about the fact that in day 1, God's first thing that God created was light, okay, but sun, moon, and stars don't show up until day 4. So what was made on day 1? Day 2, we have this kind of this expanse in the midst of the water. And on day 5, we have the waters that are created with swarming and living creatures and fowl and birds that are flying up in the heaven. Day 3, we're having dry land appearing. And day 6 is when all the creatures that are going to live on that land start to appear. So 1 goes with 4, 2 goes with 5, 3 goes with 6. So what's with 7? It literally, as I said, it is on its own. What we learn from that in part is that creation is this magnificent balance. It just works. God has made it good. And only by letting it rest can it really be holy and be fulfilled. I believe that a critical part of the climate crisis is a result of we don't let the earth rest. And there's this very odd kind of, dare I say, guilty pleasure in the coronavirus moment as we're sitting and saying, oh my God, look at the jackals are returning to the parks in Tel Aviv. Right, you've got these dolphins that are swimming in the canals in Venice. You've got the huge, decline of some of the awful air pollution that happens. The earth is ready to breathe. It needs to rest to be its fullest self. And so we see in the creation story, the opportunity is there. It is on us to take. And then if you look at what's sometimes called the second creation story in Genesis 2, that when we are living in the Garden of Eden, it is very clear we're to Ovda and Shomra. We are to serve it. We're servants to it. And we are to protect it. And that ought to govern our decisions and how we move about this world with each other and certainly the overall creation.
Absolutely. I love the idea of balance and about serving and protecting and living together with our planet. I think those are ideas, and I agree. I think they're really present right now as we are all taking this forced pause. It's really interesting to make those connections. Reverend Kelly, can you jump in and talk about ways that you feel connected through your faith tradition and ways that it helps you understand? Yeah.
Sure. Well, of course, Craig and I share a faith tradition, and we also share much of Mark's tradition as well, because Rabbi Mark is our teacher of Jewish tradition, and we carry that with us in our own scripture. And so everything about those holy passages, holy scripture passages, I think are great. I love the creation story. I think its sense of balance is really important. I always love the way that Mark talks about the the first commandment that is given to the human beings. I also like this idea that, really the commandment is tend the garden. And, as a gardener, that became more and more important to me. And I didn't actually know how painful it was to do gardening. So, after a while, it's not as fun, but that kind of a labor pays off. And so, I wrestle with that a lot. I will say that part of our tradition has worked against us. I'm old enough to remember when the Christian tradition started to wrestle with the fact that we had overemphasized original sin, and that we didn't really have a creation spirituality, a creation theology, and it started coming online in some ways in the 1970s. And it was really a reclaiming of our scriptural tradition that had been there the entire time. But as we grew as a country more and more urban and more individual, we ended up losing a sense of community and losing a sense of our wholeness and our connectedness. So, we talk about trying to figure out where our food comes from, and that seems like a strange thing for us to have to figure out. But, I just got back from the grocery, which is why I was late. And, that we're so removed from where our sources of food are. So yeah, as part of all of that tradition, I also think that for me, part of the wrestling with this tradition is I feel like I come to the environmental issues later, because I've been wrestling more of my ministry with issues of race and issues of poverty and issues of that more about the urban plight. And that's all part of the environment. We have to wrestle with all of that. And I'm not making an excuse about that at all, that one is more important than the other. Right now, we're facing such a global crisis that we have to wake up to this clearly. So, but now I'm moving much more into that. And this is the chapter that I really want to move even greater into. And so, again, I'm grateful for what Piedmont Earth Alliance is doing.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting, as the world is shifting and as we are really facing this climate crisis and seeing, through COVID, we're really seeing that when we face crisis and we have these policy and leadership failures, there's cascading effects. And we know the people that are hurt the most are the same people that are always hurt the most. So these issues of justice, of poverty, these are all issues that are all so connected. And I know I personally am feeling that more these days. One thing that I'm incredibly proud of and is our community, and is in particular the work that each of your faith communities is doing around environmental sustainability and repair, around climate justice and environmental justice. And I wonder, and you guys, I don't have to, you guys can just kind of unmute yourselves and share a little bit about what is happening in your community, what specific projects you're working on. That would be wonderful.
Well, I'll start there. I feel like I come in a little bit late to working on this issue. It has always been in my mind, but we have had struggles to try to figure out how to do that. We've always dreamed of putting solar panels on our building, and that's always been out of reach for us financially. We don't have much land. If we had land, we'd make it all into a big garden. We've done that a couple times, but that's all we've got. It's just this little postage stamp yard. So, but some of the struggles recently this last year, and Mark had been helpful in coaching me in this, is, we using this farm composting system, and we're shifting all of the programs that use our building now have to use recyclable materials, and try to be more conscious of that. And, just to tell people, we're not just doing this, we're really doing this because this is part of our theology and part of who we are in connection to it. For myself, personally, I'm shifting in my work away from working just with Green Street Church. And at the end of the year, I am planning to be away. This was all before the COVID crisis, but my intention is to actually go to East Bend, North Carolina, where we are building an organic farm and a retreat center. And so having that seems to be a fairly safe place for me to be during the week. And so I've got my hands in the dirt quite a lot these last few weeks. And that's been pretty amazing, and a lot of hard work, but a connection, a really deeper connection to the land is kind of what we're looking for in our work there.
I would highlight that for us at Temple, we started, I think it's about 10 years ago, our Temple Emanuel environmental movies. And this is, it started because, if I'm remembering the story right, and I'm very grateful to folks who run it at Temple, that, you know, we'd show kind of a film, something that concerned the environment, and maybe we'd do one or two or whatever. And of course, there's a whole genre of this. And so what happens is, and we went to, at one point we were doing 2 a month, and but really, so this is during their month that we show one movie, because we're not doing it right now because we're not all gathering, but that we're showing a movie. There are so many of these films that talk about anything from dirt to egg production, to air, to fish, I mean, all kinds of things. And then we bring in local people who are involved with this issue, literally right here in the Piedmont, whether it's farmers or advocacy people, people who are working right here in Winston-Salem. And that's been a really nice way both to get community together. I would say on any given night, there's probably between about, you know, maybe 40 to 80 people who come. And I would say about 10% are Temple people. The rest, it's the community as a whole. And it's been a really nice meeting ground that we're very proud of to get to nurture, where we can share resources with one another and recognize that whether it is on that level of something, I mean, literally in your backyard that you're doing in your own practice, or on advocacy levels. And I think that's where we try to get involved, is opening up those doors, education, actual living, whether it's changing, you know, when we changed our stuff in our social hall, that it's going to be compost or reusable products, or volunteering around town, permaculture efforts, or community gardens, or hitting on the advocacy level with groups like NC Warren, North Carolina Warren, that works to help us be aware of what happens at Duke Energy or on a policy level, and ways that we can jump in and help.
We're certainly appreciative of team and as well as the work at Green Street. I want to just say thank you, Kelly, for raising that connection between racial and economic justice and environmental justice. That's where we have to have this conversation all of the time, especially in the midst of this pandemic. We're seeing just how clearly I think faith communities are called to decolonizing work, in the way we read our sacred texts, in the way that we think about food, in the way we think about and build relationships in community. And that's really essential right now. Actually, yesterday, the United Church of Christ commemorated for Earth Day this history of environmental racism in 1982. Back here in North Carolina, in Warren County, they were strewing toxic waste along streets and roads of a predominantly African American community, and those citizens organized and said, no, this is not going to happen. And from there, we've got this growing movement of making those connections of where people live and where there's the greatest vulnerability in terms of toxicity in our environment. That connects even today to what's happening with people who are struck by this virus. So that's really important. Here at Parkway, some of the similar things, advocacy work and justice seeking around particularly some things that are happening at the state level with coal ash remediation, as well as Atlantic Coast Pipeline. I would say we try to, in every setting we have, whether it's worship or teaching right now, to make a connection to people care, earth care, fair share, because to give this sense of integration. And so we do a lot of workshops. Just before we went into lockdown, we did a shiitake mushroom inoculation workshop. So we're regularly doing those kind of practical things to have fun and also to learn together on how to be a more resilient community, to share skills, to build resilience as much as possible. We're trying to become zero waste as well, even up until the virus, hand towels in the bathrooms and that kind of thing. We're connected to across our conference with a Creation Justice Network, and we do a lot of things with other communities of faith. Back in February, we had this really fun event where we all had 5-minute videos, just really rough cut videos of what we were doing, and we shared them, and then we had discussion with popcorn and biscuits, which was a lot of fun. We have a class that is kind of spreading across the community. It's called our Drawdown Class that meets every week, going through chapter by chapter of that book called Drawdown, that shares the details of what are the most effective strategies to address climate change. We do carbon offset here. We too have been working for years on solar panels, and in the meantime, we give money to communities where efficient stoves will dramatically reduce the carbon emissions. So those are just a few things that we're engaged in.
Yeah, I'm just really heartened by the ways that y'all are really weaving, environmentalism, and to your point, Craig, what I wrote it down: people care, earth share, fair share. I think that what we need is really to weave this stuff into the fabric of our lives. And for so long, I think we have had kind of separate groups. You could be an environmentalist. But really, we all need to be committed to this work of justice and facing these environmental crises and taking care of each other and the planet. So just really grateful for the way that you all are working within your community to bring these issues up and recognize how we're all impacted. I think too often these things become political issues, or we disagree, when really at the root of it, I think most people do agree, and we see that, right? That we need to take care of each other, that we need to take care of our planet. So I'm really grateful for that. Before we get to questions from the audience, I think we're all looking for ways to be sustained spiritually, emotionally, and ethically in these times of crisis. And also, as we're aware of what's looming ahead of us, right? We're in a crisis now. We know that there are many things coming that are going to be difficult. What sustains you? What specific practices or strategies, or just kind of any tips or advice of things that are keeping you centered and sustained right now? Whoever wants to jump in.
I guess I will go. Just two things. One is, the opportunity to have blocks of time that are not as claimed as that have been in the past around programs allows me to have more time to get in the dirt. So being the last month, while I've been so crazy on a international level of news, has also been some really beautiful days. I mean, it hasn't really gotten over 75 degrees in any of those days, and it's also been just beauty and sun. And so I've had a really great experience just putting my hands in the dirt. Beyond that, though, I think that especially with the crisis at hand and how much news is coming after us, I really feel like that we're learning from this president and the distractions that have kind of come with him, how compromised our attention is. And so for me, the practice that is speaking so well to me is working for me is centering prayer, is allowing me to let a lot of the worry roll off, because obviously we can't do so as much as we think that we could about it, or that we feel like we need to. So that sense of centering prayer is helpful, and it's about connecting to a larger, more universal connection. And so anyway, that meditation practice that is now really taken hold for us in our own faith community.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Sorry, Rabbi Mark.
Not shocking. Similar to my dear friend, Reverend Kelly. I've been working in the yard more than usual, and I happen to enjoy working in the yard in general. I don't have much time to. And let's be clear, we are all facing this COVID crisis in different ways. It is, metaphors have been thrown around, we're all in the same boat together. We're not in the same boat. Whatever it is, it's very different experiences that we're having. So on the one hand, I can say, oh, it's so nice, I get to be in my yard. But on the other hand, I have a great luxury that I can sit and work in my yard. But I know that helps ground me, for no pun intended, for the work that I am trying to do to help keep people connected and aware that COVID-19 is hugely significant for this era and for our world right now. And the larger story here is the climate change and the climate injustice that's happening. And that has got to be the larger picture that we're looking at. And the kind of the intersection of those two, or the COVID-19 as a piece of that, we have to study and look into. And so I can go down a big spiral on how the story of the news and what politicians are doing or aren't doing. But ultimately, I have to ground myself literally in the ground and see what can I do in this corner of Winston-Salem, either me or with the temple and the people that our synagogue is involved with. What can we do in our corners to try to help and make things better? Again, looking at the larger picture of earth justice and people justice. And another is that Judaism, there are rituals and concepts embedded in Jewish thought. So whether it's one of the great Hasidic masters who comes along and says, you should take every day to go outside to be alone. And while Judaism really is lived fully in a community, that there is a concept of separation and being on your own to contemplate nature and to see the beauty and the magnificence, because if and when we do, we tend to come out with a lot more respect for it and wanting to preserve it and to protect it and use it wisely. This time of year we count every day starting on the second night of Passover. We count 7 weeks, and we're counting our way to Mount Sinai, kind of symbolically the idea of the Israelites being set free, having been slaves, brought into freedom. That's Passover celebration. And we work our way to Sinai when we're going to receive the Torah. That freedom doesn't come about and we just off to wander and do whatever we want with our lives. No, actually we have freedom with responsibility. And we count our way up to Sinai. We count these days each and every day. Today's the 14th day of the Omer, it's called, and the sun's soon to go down. We'll be into the 15th day. We're ascending our way in holiness. And when we take responsibility for ourselves, families, our communities, the earth, that's a way to operate in holiness. So I turn both, again, to what I can do locally and think about me as part of something larger and trying to connect broadly.
I think Jamie and Reverend Craig had started talking, but I can't hear either of you.
I think you fixed it. Reverend Craig, can you unmute now? Madeline, when I had tried to unmute, it said that the host had muted me. So if you could just unmute Craig.
Sorry about that.
I'm unmuted. I think we need Craig unmuted.
All right, thank you. I just want to underscore what I think has already been said. I really go back to Paul Hawken when he introduced this drawdown thing. He said, do the one thing that you are passionate about, that you are gifted, that you are connected to, and do it with others who share that passion. And then really trust that others are going to take their passion and do that and going to create this web of possibility and mutuality. I think, you know, I can't underestimate that we're all experiencing some degree of trauma right now. Obviously, I'm much less so than, say, our healthcare workers and those who are on the front lines of providing for our food supply and doing all of these important essential services. And we get to do what feeds us, what restores us right now. And I've heard consistently that it is very often having to do with getting outside and doing something that's restorative for us. And then that love will allow us to take the next steps for restorative practices with one another and with creation. I would say the other thing that's really feeding me right now is we've got a small, we're emerging food forest here on the church lot that we are creating and just exploring how to grow perennials in guilds, mutually supporting one another, feeds an imagination for me of what else is possible in human community.
You know, Reverend Craig, this idea of what is possible is really powerful for me right now. And I just want to add that I do think that this moment of slowdown, which many of us, though not all of us, are feeling, is a powerful moment for reimagining. I think it's very easy to say, well, we can't make change. We can't do this. We can't provide for people. You know, I think we get stuck. And I think what we're seeing is that we can make drastic changes. And now we've made some drastic changes. What will we go back to? I think there will be a lot of emphasis on business as usual when we get there. And certainly, you know, people need to have their needs met, and we need to, you know, really think about that. And also it's an opportunity through centering prayer, through getting our hands in the dirt, through all of these measures to think about and reimagine the world that we want to see, that is centered in these values that you guys articulated so well. So I just really thank you for thinking about these things together. We are going to take some questions from the audience. So if y'all want to use your Q&A box, or you can do the raised hand icon, and Madeline's going to read some questions, and we'll have our panel respond.
If you prefer to say your question out loud, definitely use the raise your hand button. And if you raise your hand, I will allow you to ask a question so that everyone can hear you.
And panelists, if you've got a question or something that you want to bring up as folks are gaining their courage.
Something I wanted to mention is a story that's really stayed with me, and it came from Mark. Mark did a Shabbat service where he was doing 8 things for the environment, and he had like 2 rain barrels, and he wasn't going to go on to the next thing, and the sermon was going to go really long until people took action for each thing. It was very smart, good. But one of the Mark, as I remember you telling the story, one of your members came up to you afterwards and said, that was really, really great, because it was all about the environment. And he said, but the reality is that if you really want to make change, you've got to deal with. We are looking with part of the crisis that we're in with the COVID crisis is the lack of policy that has been put in place and the structures that have been needed to keep us all safe. And when we think about that on an environmental issue, environmental basis, I really think that it's key. And we don't do that very well as faith communities traditionally. Now, Craig and Mark and I all have Christians that are very active. In fact, I think all of us probably have people in our congregation that are probably a little more radical than we are. Luckily, maybe not even in the faith, but still, hanging out. No, I'm kidding. But that is it's something that we're a part of it as far as faith and activism, but that is not the norm, I think, for communities of faith. But things have to change on that kind of policy scale, and I think we have to be able to interact in that area. How to do that is harder because the changes that need to happen are almost not only a national, but on an international basis. And so somehow to figure out how to make those connections between what we do with local action and how that impacts a more, on a policy level is really important.
Kelly, thank you so much for remembering one of my sermons. I mean, that's outstanding. May other people also. That was a Rosh Hashanah sermon that I did. And Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year, and is a notoriously long service. So I said, we can decide how long the service is going to be right here, right now. Who wants a rain barrel or commit to lowering their thermostat? And that it is, I would say that in the Hebrew expression, it says gam v'gam, that it is both the individual actions of what we do, because what we do and what we spend our money on, corporations respond to that. But it absolutely, you're 100% right, Kelly, that it is the policy level. If we look at the drastic reduction of use of oil right now, which is a huge, you want to talk about environmental disaster needing to happen right now because there's not enough storage for all this oil that keeps getting pumped. But how, and going back to what Jamie said, look at the changes that we have made in our society virtually overnight, max 4 weeks, right? Overnight, the world has changed how it does business. And a lot of people are suffering right now as a result of that. I don't want to overlook that. But it shows what is possible and that we really can make massive policy changes. Okay, we might not like one of the politicians or whoever's doing certain things, but we have our vote. And please God, we have a chance to exercise it appropriately. But it has to be this whole multi-pronged approach: individual action, corporates, government, policies, forcing decisions. And I really applaud our mayor here in Winston-Salem, who has, and along with a lot of other mayors, who when the president decided to back out of the Paris Climate Accords, that I believe was our mayor and other mayors and governors who said, we're going to keep going with that. We're going to shoot for that because we know it's the right thing. And that is our role, I think, as preachers. We call out that the earth, this is a moral issue. It's made political, but it is a moral issue at its core. And how we respond to taking care of the earth. That's on us to, as faith leaders, along with others, to think about what is right.
Rabbi Mark, I love that you talked about how important it is to approach these issues from so many different layers, whether you're a business or an individual or a church or a nonprofit. There's so many things that you can do to contribute to this thing that we all have a part in. And I think that's a great lead in to our first question from the audience. We have a question from Gwyneth who asks, my own faith community has responded to questions of their environmental impact as saying that more eco-friendly practices are just too expensive. What suggestions do you have for churches that don't see these practices in their budgets?
I feel that. Our church went from very few members and really behind in a budget for, number of years, 10 years or so, where we felt like we were always lacking something, to now where we're, very much a medium-sized congregation and have some, in some ways we can't even think as a medium-sized congregation, even in our middle-class area, because we've been pinching pennies for so long. So part of what it was for us is we had to say, look, it's not just us, but it's everybody that uses our building. So we had to talk with our Narcotics Anonymous groups, with the harm reduction groups, with the Shalom Project, everybody that was using the space. And we said, look, we're all going to change. We're all going to take this on. This might be a little bit more expensive for us, but we also get the benefit of saying, look, we all get to be in this project together. And so anyway, that's been sort of the commitment. I do think that is a hard thing when, styrofoam cups may be cheaper than any green cups that you can throw away, or same thing with plates. And, those were some of the issues that I've always wrestled with in churches, impact-wise. But, the kind of impacts that you can have about saving energy in churches, alternative energies, those take a little bit more, I think, advanced and some income to do that, but they're great investments into the future. And we haven't been in a congregation where we can make some of those decisions yet. And I'm sure I'll get, Phyllis Baker Smith is going to come after me on this and probably give me all kinds of suggestions that we can do. But I think that those are the kinds of things that we, have really struggled with. So it's a real issue for folks.
I always say small, slow solutions are often the ones that are actually what helps us make the connection that this is part of our values and our life of faith. Yeah, there are many steps that do cost a great deal of money. And we start with where the biggest impact is and what we can do, and we make that commitment and we seal that commitment, and then we move to the next thing. We build momentum through that. One thing that we've been working on, we've been paying for a yard service. We don't need grass. So we're trying to rip up our grass, so we don't need that service anymore. And just plant perennials where there was grass. That's just one small example. I want to just get back to the policy piece for a moment, because I think it's really important. And I'm just going to say this because it is public knowledge right now. We've been trying to reach out to a local company. It's called Structural Steel. A couple of weeks ago, some researchers published a list of the 100 greatest air polluters in the United States. And we have one on that list right here in Winston-Salem, just off of Highway 52. It's called Structural Steel. They are in compliance from 2018 with clean air regulations, but we all know just how dramatically Clean Air Act regulations have been rolled back over the last 3 years, such that the latest reports say the air pollution is worse now than it has been for a very long time. And so right close to that plant is Skyline Village Apartments, where there are several hundred children under the age of 5 who are breathing in manganese and chromium and other toxic levels. And so that's something that I think we are called to have conversation about right here on a local level in regard to policy.
Absolutely. I think one thing that I actually take heart in, I think right now federal policy seems really difficult to change because, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. But institutional change is still something that we can work for. And so what you're talking about, Reverend Craig, is we have power. People have power when we come together. We have power in our communities, whatever they are, to make changes in our hospitals, in our schools, with our corporations. And that's somewhere that we can really make a difference. And that's something that we work on with Piedmont Environmental Alliance. I really want to talk to you offline, Reverend Craig, about how we can organize, because that's what it takes. People have power, even on policy, even on these big issues. We can make these big changes. Shall we? I think we've got time for one more question from the audience. Madeline, do you want to read one?
We haven't gotten any more yet, but we can still submit questions. If you want to submit a question, but you're maybe a little confused about the Q&A box, I'm also happy to take questions through the chat box. So if you want to utilize the chat box, I can read out questions from there as well.
Madeline, I think that Michelle Nicole Jason has given us a really good question to deal with, and that is the deep grief associated with the climate crisis. From our Buddhist clergy person has put that question up there, so I think that would be great to address that. In our congregation, we had a child die about 2 years ago, and our congregation has learned a great deal about grief and the cost of grief, the cost of not dealing with it, how it affects an entire community. And so, it has been I've been very conscious of how grief is really affecting us throughout this whole COVID crisis. I think it also happens within the environment, and so the climate crisis as well. Like all forms of grief, it has all kinds of different levels, and I think for a great number of people in our world, we're in a state of denial and really stuck there. I think a lot of people also, when we are given the information that oftentimes about what is at threat to our world, it can be overwhelming, and it can shut us down. And having been through some heavy amounts of grief this past year, that I feel that. And when we think about how much we can take, so I think that these are all kinds of pieces of what's happening in a climate crisis. We need opportunities for us to be able to say, where's the hope in all of that, and to name that and to kind of look for that. David Rodwell, for those of you who haven't heard his presentation, he does the presentations that Al Gore put together, and they're really amazing, really informative. And he never leaves us with just all the bad news. He always is kind of pointing to some good signs, and we need some of that as well. And that's, I think, is helpful for the addressing the grief. But I like that question that Jason has given to us there.
Jason, thank you for that question. I want to just lift up the work of a Buddhist spiritual teacher, Joanna Macy, the work that reconnects. I have a dream that we, in an interfaith and cross-tradition sort of way here in Forsyth County, could begin to do some of the rituals around this that begins with gratitude to create a space where we can be vulnerable, and then to be able to experience our pain so that we could actually have new eyes to see something different. And there are lots of beautiful rituals in this work that reconnects, that really open up a space for us to go through all of the different dynamics of grieving.
In Jewish life, when somebody close to you dies, and the immediate mourning circle would be a sibling, a parent, a child, or a spouse, you sit Shiva, which is from 7 days after burial. We are to be at home, and there are prayers are recited. People come to visit you, and you're really not to engage in life as you normally would at all. When Shiva is over, when that 7 day mourning period is over, there's a custom to go out and walk the block. And if we just kind of parallel that to our world right now, I'm really struck at how many people are out walking. I mean, so many people in our neighborhood. There are people who walk in our neighborhood with some regularity, but nothing like what's gone on in the last couple of weeks. And I think that what that story of Shiva, what that tells us or informs us and forces us to do is take the time to grieve the loss. There's a lot of loss that's happened. Yes, certainly in this COVID-19 story of what we're going through, but writ large in terms of climate change and the crisis that's going on with the earth. There's a lot to grieve, and there's a lot of readings to do. And my goodness, the Buddhist tradition offers so very much for us to turn to and think about. And in our own traditions, there's a lot to look at. To take that time to study, to read, to reflect, to cry, to mourn, to be angry, all those different stages that are there. And then the time comes, you never really leave that grieving behind. We're always carrying grief. It just ebbs and flows. But there is a time to then come out and take a walk and see the world, and you're seeing the world with new eyes because of what you've now been through. And you'd be wrong to not remember and hold that, but also recognize the power of taking those steps and the need to take those steps, living altered for, please God, for life, in this life, in this world in which we are inhabiting, and have to think about how are we going to get along and make this a good world and a good life.
I think those are just really powerful ideas to think about how we hold grief and connection and action. And I think that's the work for a lot of us here. And I'm really grateful for you all taking some time tonight. I'm just seeing in the comments how powerful it is to be able to have a conversation like this and hear from different folks who are coming from some of the same places and some slightly different angles. I think, in this time, part of what we need is connection. So I just really appreciate feeling so connected to this group of 40 or so folks tonight. So thank you very, very much for your time, for speaking together. I'm really looking forward through Piedmont Environmental Alliance to doing more of this, to having more conversations with more leaders about what we can do and how we can make our values more centered in our community and really woven through the fabric of all the things we do. So thank you, Reverend Craig, Rabbi Mark, Reverend Kelly. Thank you to our audience and participants. It's been wonderful. Check out, we'll have this video online and all the other Earth Day Fair, virtual Earth Day Fair programs up at peanc.org. Any last thoughts or things that anyone wants to share?
No, thank you, Jamie. Keep up the good work, Madeline, Jamie, that we need you all.
Yes, we do. Thank you. Thank you so very much for the honor of being here. Great to be with my colleagues and friends.
Yes, thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to be in discussion and continue on PEA.
All right. Hope to see you all in person soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.